Here's the review for pages 3 and 4 of your review lesson. So, this activity says to compare numbers with absolute value. So compare each pair of expressions using greater than, less than, or equal to. Before comparing any numbers, make sure you convert any number in absolute value notation into what it actually equals. So that last part is going to be super important. Once again, as a review, absolute value is a number's distance from zero. How far away is that number from zero? And we always measure absolute value in positive units. All right, so looking at number 1, there's no absolute value notation there. We just have negative 20 and 15. And 15 is greater than negative 20. Once again, because positives are always larger than negatives. Now this next one, we have two different numbers, both in absolute value. We would say this number as the absolute value of negative 19, and this is the absolute value of 5. So once again, instead of just thinking of that number as it is, we need to think of that number in terms of how far away it is from 0. And so I know that negative 19 is 19 units away from 0. I would be counting 19 units to the left. So its absolute value is actually just 19. And 5 is 5 units from 0. 5 to the right. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. So once again, whenever we talk about absolute value, it's always measured in positive units. So when we're talking about negative numbers and their absolute value, it becomes positive. Positive numbers will just stay positive. And so as we can see, what we initially thought, we would initially have thought this was less. If it was just negative 19 and 5, this would be less. But because it was the absolute value of both of those numbers, this was actually the larger one. All right, for number 3, we have 2 and negative 2. Well, 2 is larger. Once again, positives are always larger than negatives. Now for number 4, we don't have 2 and negative 2, we have the absolute value of 2 and the absolute value of negative 2. So once again, we need to ask ourselves, how far is this from 0 and how far is this from 0? Because it's not just those numbers, it's their absolute value. I know 2 is 2 units to the right of 0, and I know negative 2 is 2 units to the left of 0. So both of these numbers actually have the same absolute value. They are opposites. They are the same distance from 0. So the absolute value of 2 and negative 2 is actually equal. Next one, 1/4 and negative 14. Once again, 1/4 is greater. Positives are always greater than negatives. Number 6, 2 and the absolute value of negative 17. So negative 17, I know, is 17 units to the left of 0. So its absolute value is 17. And once again, after finding this number's absolute value, we can see that that was actually larger. Next one, absolute value of negative 18 and absolute value of negative 36. Absolute value of negative 18, this is 18 units to the left. This is 36 units to the left. And so after finding their absolute value, this number actually happens to be larger. And for number 8, absolute value of negative 18 and the absolute value of negative 36. Sorry, not the absolute value of negative 36. This is just plain old negative 36. So I have to convert this into 18. So once again, 18 units to the left. And the absolute value of negative 18 is larger than the absolute value. Just negative 36. Once you start saying absolute value a whole bunch, it's easy for it to just keep coming out. All right, so define absolute value and why negative 5, the absolute value of negative 5 has greater value than 4. So absolute value is a number's distance from 0. And so the absolute value of negative 5 is actually 5. And we know that 5 is greater than 4. So the thing is, 4 is just the number 4. This is the number negative 5's distance from 0. So if we're talking about this number's distance from 0, its distance from 0 is actually positive 5. So its value is actually more than that of just plain old 4. On the next page, all right, so now once again we are talking back about negative numbers in context. This time we are talking about temperature. So when we talk about temperature and negative numbers, we do have negative degrees in Fahrenheit. Ohio actually does get in the negative degrees Fahrenheit relatively often. But in math class, we mainly talk about degrees Celsius because Celsius is just like a lot easier to understand, because for Celsius, 0 degrees is the freezing point. That is where water begins to freeze, where snow begins to form. In Fahrenheit, 32 degrees is the freezing point, which is kind of, for the context, when we're talking about negative numbers, that doesn't really help us so much. So we'll be talking about degrees Celsius. And so once again, this is just another number line, right? So here's our normal one going left from right. This one goes up and down, just like elevation does. So just like how we normally say left is less, down is less here, okay? It's essentially just a number line turned on its side, right? And as we go down, as the negatives seem to get larger, it's actually getting colder. So -8 is the coldest temperature shown on this thermometer. So which temperature is colder, -12 or -6? -12 degrees Celsius is colder. Once again, and that is because larger the negative, smaller it is. So as numbers get smaller, it gets colder. Which temperature is closer to freezing point? And once again, freezing point, that is another way of saying 0 when talking about degrees. -12 or -6? Well, so -6 is here. We can see its distance from 0 is 6 units. -12 isn't even shown on this thermometer. It would actually be down here if it kept going. So when we're talking about being closer to freezing point, remember, freezing point is just another way of saying 0. So essentially what we're doing here is we're actually talking about these two numbers' absolute values. And so the absolute value, or -12 degrees Celsius' distance from freezing point, or 0, is 12. And the distance of -6 from freezing point is 6. So 6 is closer to freezing point. -12 degrees Celsius is colder, and so -6 degrees Celsius is closer to freezing point. Which temperature is colder, 3 degrees Celsius or -4 degrees Celsius? -4 degrees Celsius. So just like how we normally say negatives are less than positives, negatives are colder than positives. We're talking about temperature here. And now, which temperature is closer to freezing point? So once again, now we're talking about closer to freezing point. So distance from 0. Distance from 0 means absolute value. So absolute value of 3 and the absolute value of -4. 3 is 3 spaces from freezing point, and -4 is 4 spaces from freezing point. So 3 is closer to freezing point. So important to know a warmer temperature can be closer to freezing point. Right? Oftentimes when we think about freezing point, we hear the word freezing and we think like colder. So we always think that the colder the number, the closer to freezing point it is. Not necessarily, right? So like -100 degrees Celsius is freezing. But that even though it's colder than 3, 3 is closer to freezing point, because freezing point is just 0. So that's just important to note. All because the temperature is colder does not necessarily mean it is closer to freezing point than something that is warmer. And how are -4 and the absolute value of -4 different? Well, -4 is just that number. The absolute value of -4 is -4's distance from 0. And so the absolute value of -4, its distance from 0, is +4. And so the absolute value of -4 is actually greater than -4. Because once again, this isn't talking just about -4, it's talking about -4's distance from 0, which is +4.